Kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of Big Hairy News. It is ANZAC Day. Technically, this is a pre-recorded show, but we do have some never-seen-before footage for you from, well, unless you're a patron. If you're a patron, you might have seen some of the footage before. So good to be with you. Coming up tonight on the show, we're actually going to replay a conversation from 2022 with the president of the RSA, BJ Clark, kind of telling us about ANZAC Day, what it all means for the RSA. And also one of the more interesting parts of that conversation is when we asked him about conscientious objectors like Archibald Baxter. That's coming up during the show tonight. Also, Olli Hellmann is coming up. As I said, if you're a patron, you may already have seen this. How do societies collectively remember their past through the media? That's where his academic area of speciality is. And so how do we remember ANZAC Day as a collective society through media? A really interesting conversation around how we celebrate, commemorate ANZAC Day versus what it was really all about. And the big question is, we think about ANZAC Day, like if you're watching a movie, it starts on the boat's landing. Whereas the question that Olli wants to look at is, why did the boats have to go there at all? And that's what we talk about. And also, a bit of late notice, but lovely opportunity to hang out with Paul Barlow, Paul the other one. We had to talk about the High Court ruling that came out during the live show last night. High Court ruling saying that the Waitangi Tribunal could not summon Karen Chhour to come to them. So I managed to have a chat with Paul this afternoon. And we're going to talk to that, and also because he's a media guy like me, he loves his media. We do touch on the Melissa Lee situation as well, just to get his perspective. So all that coming up for you tonight. Also, I just want to remind you that we are opening up our merch store. You're thinking of pre-record, I'd nail this, wouldn't you? Opening up our merch store again this and next week, April, May merch, and we're doing a bit of a special today. We are going and doing some sponsorship for the group MAPS. Now, MAPS are medical assistance to Palestinians, medical aid, we'll go with medical aid to Palestinians, there it is, and medical aid for Palestinians. And we are selling merch this month, or this kind of couple of weeks, that has a Palestinian/Gazan vibe to it. The Buffer brand is about being a buffer and standing in the middle. Every piece of Buffer merch that is bought, we will donate 25% of the profits to medical aid for Palestinians. Now, if you're only doing it, because obviously we get something out of that as well, but if you only are doing it to support medical aid for Palestinians, feel free just to go directly to their website, map.org.uk, and just donate to them directly as well. All of the merch is up now. If you get your order in before the end of this upcoming weekend, which is like the 29th or something, I'll put the first order through on Monday morning. That means the printer should have the shirts to him by Wednesday, hopefully printed by Friday next week, and we'll be sending them out. If you order after Monday, then you can expect to see your merch a week after that. Remember, if you're going to get personalized stuff, to pick the personalized hoodie, it's a little bit more expensive than just the hoodie. That's because we pay more to have it on the back. And please remember, if you're going to make a purchase and you are someone who lives in a rural delivery area, you will know if you are, then please make sure you click the rural delivery option in the postage area. Okay, let's rip into this. How about we start the show where we finished 2 years ago? Let's check out RSA then President BJ Clark joining me and Chewy and a little fella named George. For you old timers, you may remember George, having a chat all about ANZAC Day. Because we have joining us the national president. I think we have to sit up straight, boys, and be on our best behaviour, because we have the national president of the RSA coming on, BJ Clark. BJ, good morning and thanks for joining us.
Actually, it's me sitting up straight to talk to you guys.
Lovely to have you with us. Thank you so much. Obviously, yesterday being ANZAC Day, we thought it would be great to catch up with the RSA and have a bit of a chat about, ANZAC Day in general and what it's all about. Maybe you could do that for us, because obviously ANZAC Day, from when it started, has sort of evolved a bit into what it is today. So if I was an alien landing on the planet and had never heard of ANZAC Day before, how would you describe it to me, BJ?
Well, I suppose we go back to its origins. Obviously, it's from Gallipoli, the landing at Gallipoli, when ANZAC, the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, when they both together served on the battlefields in Gallipoli. And so ANZAC Day was started as remembrance of the bravery of the service of those veterans. And unfortunately, they said that the World War I was the war to end all wars, and we all know that it hasn't been and won't be for some time by the look of things. However, it's also become an important part of just acknowledging all those that have served New Zealand in the armed forces who have lost their lives, and even those that came back who have been affected either physically or mentally. So, and also, I think what we try to encourage is that we should also remember that we have people every day today serving overseas. And so on ANZAC Day, we should also acknowledge them. So it's an acknowledgement of the service of all of those in our three armed services.
And how was the actual celebrations yesterday? Where are you based and what did you get up to?
I'm actually based in Christchurch, but I was at Wellington for the services at Pukeahu. The dawn service, well done Wellington. A massive number of people attending there. It was the sea of faces as you looked out into the public arena it was great. The 11 o'clock service, a bit smaller, but again, well supported. And then I also attend a service on the Wellington Heads at the Ataturk Memorial with the Turkish people, and that's also an amazing service. A country who we tried to invade, who actually, and frankly, kicked our butts, whose leadership acknowledged our service people as their brothers, and that they'll always remember them. And so the link between the Turkish people and the New Zealand people is still as strong as it ever was.
BJ, I was thinking back to past ANZAC days, possibly when, I guess with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, war is fresh in our minds, but I'm thinking back to past ANZAC days when maybe New Zealand was more involved in Afghanistan or Iraq, for example. And often we saw this debate in public discourse around what ANZAC Day means, right? Is it a day, and you can tell us your opinion on this, is it a day for that sort of solemn reflection and a reminder of not forgetting? Or should it be sort of a day where we can have those conversations possibly about New Zealand's role in the world contemporarily?
I think it's both. I think you should be able to have those conversations that you talk about at any time. And that's exactly why our service personnel went overseas, was to enable people to have conversations. And I'll expand on that a little bit shortly. But it certainly is a time of reflection. It's a time where family members remember their forebears who served. And for me, I go to an ANZAC parade and I see the grandchild or great-grandchild of a veteran who's on that parade carrying granddad's or great-granddad's medals, and I think that's amazing. So what we do need, I think, is to ensure that we keep discussing with our young people what it's all about. ANZAC Day, let's be very clear, is not about glorifying war. It should never be. It's about remembrance. There's no one, you won't find anyone at an ANZAC service that wants to glorify war. But the interesting thing, you talk about debate. I think debate can be around those subjects that are akin to ANZAC Day. But I have to say that I was, I'll use a polite term, angered, to find there were certain elements of the public who wanted to use their platform to gain some publicity on ANZAC Day, and that shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen on any event. Those veterans went so that you could have your opinion, you could put it out there, but you don't do it on a day of reflection, which is all about the veteran.
To clarify, BJ, you're talking about the so-called sheriffs that are up in Paraparaumu.
Them, and there are others around the country. There was a slight disruption at Pukeahu at the 11 o'clock service. There was threats in a couple of other places. But let them have their day on their own platform. But so you'd say, so why are you choosing ANZAC Day? And the reality is, it's because they know there will be a lot of media around, and they're hoping that will enhance their platform. And I'm so pleased that the media really didn't give it a lot of attention.
I am a very firm believer in that ANZAC Day is an anti-war thing, certainly for myself. I've had relatives fight in France both times. And in 2015, I travelled right throughout Europe, in Gallipoli and Italy and Crete, to all of these places that New Zealanders had fought in those theatres. I find it really interesting that there are people that consider it a commemoration, almost like a national mourning or a start of the New Zealand becoming its own its own entity, its own country, rather than an extension of the empire. But I worry sometimes as we get further and further away that it becomes more of a just straight patriotic, as you said, a glorification. I see that a bit in Australia, and I hope that doesn't come in over here. Be interested in your thoughts on that.
Look, I acknowledge and respect your position, and I think again, I have got no problems with that. If we want to get everyone thinking the same way, then we become a robot country. And so everyone, again, should have the opportunity to express their issues. However, what I don't want to see is, as happened in Paraparaumu, where we are holding a service to acknowledge in whichever way that those attendees wish to, the service of those around the country, and it is interrupted by people with another agenda. That's all that worries me. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. Through New Zealand's involvement in Vietnam, there was this country was torn apart by people on their opinions of whether we should have been there or not. And let's not forget, it's not the service personnel that are there that have the choice. They're sent there, and so that's when they sign up. They sign up to go wherever they're told, so they do it. But the treatment of our veterans, particularly when they come back from Vietnam, was nothing less than an embarrassment to this country. And a number of those veterans who then retreated into areas of New Zealand where you don't see a lot of the light of day, whether it be up the east coast of the North Island or the west coast of the South Island, and they were severely affected. I mean, they were brought in at night undercover. Some of them were embarrassed. Well, not embarrassed. Some of them didn't wear their medals because of the reaction it got from people. They were called all sorts of names, and that's not acceptable. Those people were just doing the job they were sent away to do. But then on the other side of that, what we as a country have a responsibility to do is look after those veterans as they come back. Many of them were affected not only physically but mentally. And that mental stress, brought in things like alcoholism and mistreatment of their family, and there's no denying that. So the whole picture of ANZAC Day is more than remembrance, but that is what we should be doing. We should acknowledge our veterans for the service they do, and now we are concentrating very much on the younger veterans, as you said, Afghanistan, Timor, the Solomons. We've just sent some people over and to support of what's happening in the Ukraine. Now, whilst that might be a bit of a benign operation, we sent 9 intelligence personnel across there. And so you've got to remember that they may well be dealing with images and making decisions that are going to be very difficult for them. And whilst that's not declared as an operational deployment, we don't know what effect that will have on them mentally down the track on the decisions that they make or what they see. So it's a really big picture. And that's the whole thing about ANZAC Day. It isn't just one thing. It's an opportunity for individuals who have lost family members or had family members to remember them. And it's an opportunity for those that serve to get together again to talk about, what they got up to when they were away. And that very rarely is about, the glorifying war. It'll be things like, hey, remember when you got that Land Rover, went into town and flogged that bottle of wine and a couple of chickens to make the evening meal a little bit better, or when we went and had a great time and wherever and chatted up a couple of ladies or whatever. It's and remember our mates that are gone, whether it was in service or that have gone since that service. So it's a time for catch up. Some of those guys don't see each other for from one ANZAC day to the other, and it's an opportunity for them to say, mate, are you okay? And you're not looking too good. I think you should contact your local RSA and see if they can help you. Those are the things about ANZAC Day. It's quite a wide thing.
BJ, thanks for joining us. I just want to finish with one quick question. It probably feels natural to wrap the conversation now, but I did want to ask you one thing. And here in Dunedin, we've got a statue of this man announcing the city, Archibald Baxter. And I was just interested as I was hearing you talk, and especially about it not being a place to glorify war. How does the RSA think of, and what do the members kind of think of the pacifism message and those conscientious objectors who refused to fight? I'm not even asking necessarily for an official position, but how are the people who maybe in our history who have been the conscientious objectors, how are they kind of thought of and treated by the RSA?
To be honest, I've never raised that discussion or had that discussion, and maybe that's something that to enhance my my knowledge I should have. And I think probably if I look at some of the historical reading that I've seen, I think at the time I think they were treated harshly. Because it was expected that you went down the road and signed up, and I think anyone who didn't, was probably treated quite harshly. And I think now it's been a long time since people have had to make a decision or express that they are a conscientious objector, because we haven't had mass recruitment to go to a war. So an interesting one you raise. I remember there's a movie, and I can't remember what it was, about a gentleman who joined the American forces, and he didn't want to carry a rifle. That's it.
Hacksaw Ridge.
Yeah, and he was treated poorly because he didn't want to carry a rifle and be a soldier on the front line. And yet that man, through being a medic, his heroism is just it's unparalleled. It was amazing.
Yeah. And that little man grew up to be Spider-Man. No, it's just the actor who played him. So, hey, BJ, thanks for joining us. Really do appreciate you giving us some time this morning. I'm sure you're very sought after in these sort of couple of days in particular. So I really appreciate you give our little conversation some time. National President of the RSA, BJ Clark. BJ, thanks for joining us. Really do very much appreciate your time.
Kia ora, guys, and have a great day. Thank you.
Okay, whānau. That was the then president of the RSA, BJ Clark. Still to come, we're going to hear from Paul, the other one, talking about the High Court ruling around Karen Chhour. And there's another clip coming up for you next, which is a completely different one, which we'll get to in a sec. Anyway, I wanted to say thanks to all our patrons. You'll notice for the last 2 nights we haven't been putting the billboard up, and that's because we've had a fair few people signing up, and we need to do a fair bit of work on the billboard to have it all work. So you'll see that again on Monday. We're on a bit of a drive at the moment to try and get new patrons. If you like what we do, if you value what we do, and probably, and maybe even more so, more importantly, if you think what we do can be put out to other people, and you think that other people may value what we're doing, then we would encourage you to think about becoming a patron. Every little dollar genuinely helps, and patrons get advanced screenings, advanced interviews that are pre-records, and other people don't get to see until the next day or later that night. We have regular meetups. There's other advantages which come with different levels of being the patron. If you have the ability, we're very cool if you don't. if you don't have the ability, if you've got no spare cash, it's fine. Just enjoy. But for those of you that do have a spare couple of bucks, and if you want to literally support what we're doing, helping us pay the bills for what we're producing to give to, society, then maybe you'd consider heading to patreon.com/Big Hairy News. As I said, we're on a bit of a drive at the moment. We're trying to get 50 new patrons. I think we've got about 12 or 13 in the last 3 days. So probably 30, 35 left to get with our little meaningless target that we are finding very difficult to measure. But if you're keen on getting on board, it's patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Paul, the other one coming up very, very shortly. But right now, let's have a chat with Olli Hellmann. Olli Hellmann has an area of academia where he looks at how societies collectively remember their past through media. So how do we collectively remember ANZAC Day? Through the media. What does it tell us? One of the big questions that we've been asking is not just that the boys landed on the beach at ANZAC Cove, right? Not just that, it's not the starting point, but why they landed on the beach at ANZAC Cove. So that's a conversation we're having right now with Olli Hellmann. Want to welcome to the show Associate Professor from the University of Waikato, Olli Hellmann. Olli, thank you for joining us today.
Kia ora, Pat. Thanks for having me.
So I'm looking forward to it, mate. I'm just looking at your bio on the University of Waikato page. It says, I specialise in political communications with a practical focus on 2 broader questions. How do societies collectively remember their past through media? How do visual images shape our understanding of the political world? So we're today going to talk about an article that you wrote for the conversation titled From Gallipoli to Gaza, Remembering the Anzacs not as a coming-of-age tale, but as a lesson for the future. Before we start to have a look at that article, is there anything else that you want to explain about who you are and what you're speaking to with this conversation?
Yeah, maybe. Because it's quite a complex topic, obviously, what we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment. So I should probably explain that I'm not an expert on Middle East politics. So I do specialize, as you just read out, in collective memory. So the question that drives my research is, why do societies remember the past in a certain way, and what are the effects of that in the present?
Yeah, cool. That leads me beautifully into my first question, which is, you say in your article that we don't often think of the why our boys, New Zealanders, Australians, ended up at Gallipoli. We start our story from the landing, which I think about every movie I've watched about Gallipoli, and that is exactly the opening scene. It's the landing, and then from there on in. So why did we end up being in Gallipoli? We should probably, because I've never thought of that question before reading your article, we should probably look at why we were there.
I mean, look, the history of World War I is incredibly complex, and there's lots of reasons why World War I broke out, and historians themselves can't quite agree on how to best explain World War I. But what we know about the Gallipoli mission is that the aim was to clear the Dardanelles of any Turkish positions, so that British warships and French warships could then proceed towards Constantinople, which was the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman capital at the time, nowadays Istanbul. So that was the plan. It was to attack Constantinople, but before they could do that, they had to clear the Dardanelles, including the Gallipoli Peninsula, of any Ottoman defenses. So that's why the ANZAC troops ended up there, because they were nearby. They had just crossed half the planet in a big convoy, had just made it through the Suez Canal, so they were in Egypt, close by, and that's why they were drafted into that mission.
You also refer to the way we're telling the Gallipoli story today as a selective retelling. Now, when I hear the word selective retelling, I kind of think about nefarious actions, like someone's kind of on purpose, they're lightening up the story to make it sound better for, it's the victors who tell the stories. Do you think there is something nefarious to the way we're retelling it? Or has it been so long ago and been retold so many times, it's just ignorance now that people aren't telling it what you were talking about as correctly?
I think, I get your point that it sounds a bit nefarious when we speak about selective storytelling. So what that implies is that someone focused on certain aspects of the story but ignored other aspects of the story. But if you think about it, all storytelling has to be selective, right? So if I asked you now to retell the story of your life, you have a certain idea in your head of who you are as a person. And so what you would probably do is look back at your life and then choose some key events that shaped you as a person. And then you string those events together into a plot. Okay, so storytelling is always selective, because once you select some key events and then string them together into a story, you have to ignore other events that don't necessarily fit into this coherent story that you want to tell. So by its very nature, storytelling is always selective. So we always need to decide, what do we include, what do we exclude? Now, the point I make in the article is that what we do exclude from our narrative of World War I and Gallipoli is that the British were pursuing their own colonial ambitions during World War I, and New Zealand, as a dominion in the British Empire, was happy to supply troops in order to support Britain in its ambitions. Although, having said that, a lot of these ambitions were being kept secret, so were not openly discussed. But there were indications that Britain had an interest in parts of the Ottoman Empire. And my argument is that we do exclude that part of history from our narrative because we like to retell the events of Gallipoli as a coming of age story. Okay, so the way in which we remember Gallipoli is that, this is when the young nation of New Zealand grew up, and it joined the global community of great powers fighting in World War I, and it went through this test of courage and manhood. And of course, this narrative only works if we ignore that New Zealand and ANZAC troops were just, sort of a small cog in the imperial machine, so to speak, following British orders, and were in fact not emancipating themselves from British rule, but they were very much part of the British club at the time, fighting in World War I to further British colonial ambitions. So that's why I argue we don't focus on the why question, because then this whole coming of age narrative collapses. It doesn't work when New Zealand didn't emancipate itself from the British Empire in World War I, but it was very much a part of the British Empire. It fought alongside the British to extend the British Empire and take over parts of the crumbling Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, I mean, my words now, but when you start to think about the story as a part of the British Empire's, expansion, that means we're a part of the colonizers. And that term today in New Zealand in 2024 has some pretty icky vibes to it. So to think about New Zealand being a part of a group that was attempting to continue to colonize the world does put a very different slant on it. Do you think, thinking about that angle, that perspective of the story, that does or should change the commemoration of ANZAC Day? I mean, there will be some people who find this incredibly offensive. Like they'll think it's not about that. It is about the boys and New Zealand growing up. But do you think if we approach it from the way you're talking about it, that changes the way we commemorate the sacrifice that some of those young men made at Gallipoli, but also subsequent wars as well?
Look, I think we can definitely still commemorate those men who lost their lives at Gallipoli in World War I, in subsequent conflicts. I think shifting the focus of the commemoration slightly doesn't mean that we have to forget about the thousands of New Zealand men who lost their lives in those wars. And in fact, a lot of these men didn't know what they were doing. A lot of the volunteers before conscription was brought in, a lot of the volunteers, they were sort of excited by heroic tales of war, and they thought this would be, over by Christmas, and they would be home very soon. But in fact, they didn't know what was waiting for them. I mean, World War I was the first war fought with modern industrial weapons. It was like nothing the world had ever seen before. So, these men ended up in a war that was the most horrific event, perhaps in human history up until that point in time. So I think we can still commemorate the men and honor the men who lost their lives in Gallipoli in World War I. And in fact, many more men lost their lives on the Western Front in World War I than in Gallipoli, but still we decided to focus on Gallipoli because it was, that first battle, which also works to craft this coming of age story, because, it was the first test of strength and courage. But I think, rather than remembering Gallipoli as a coming of age story, I think, it might make sense it might be more appropriate to face up to what Britain was doing in World War I and the role that New Zealand troops played alongside the British in pursuing British colonial ambitions. So I don't think the two exclude each other. We can still commemorate the death, but at the same time, I think we can shift the focus onto the why question and ask ourselves, why did we send those men there? And I think that the way in which I conclude the article is by suggesting that perhaps we could narrate it as a lesson for the future. I mean, what we learned from Gallipoli is not to follow great powers into their military adventures, because we see now, looking at the situation in Palestine and the Middle East more broadly, where that particular adventure led. I mean, Britain dividing up the Ottoman Empire drew the borders that we see nowadays in the Middle East, and that's what's fueling the conflict in the region.
Yeah,
So
one of the things that makes you a bit uncomfortable reading your article is it kind of portrays Britain somewhat as the bad guys, and the Allied forces and our help with them. We always wear the white hat in the stories, but it kind of makes them the bad guy, and it's pretty uncomfortable. I'm wondering if there's any research or if you have any opinion on the idea of Britain using an expansionist kind of idea about growing their empire. Do you think that, or is there any evidence that how far down the chain that was known? Like the generals in New Zealand or the chain of command in New Zealand, would they have known anything about this, or is this really behind closed doors in London conversations?
I mean, first of all, I think I want to challenge this sort of black and white view of history, or this tendency to categorize protagonists in historical events as either the goodies or the baddies. And Britain pursued its own colonial ambitions in the Middle East, and that's what my article focuses on. But at the same time, Britain entered the war because Germany had invaded neutral Belgium at the time, and attacked France, which was a British ally. So it's not quite as easy to categorize the British as the bad guys. Things are very complex, and there's a lot of gray area between the black and the white, and the goodies and the baddies. So history is a lot more complex than a simple dichotomy like that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I guess I'm saying that's how we perceive it. We perceive it as good guys and bad guys, but there doesn't appear to be anyone who doesn't. I mean, you can look to the Gaza conflict at the moment with Israel. There's no one there with clean hands. You know, no one who's sending rockets have clean hands in that conversation. I'm also wondering, because your article does talk about the parallel between the Middle East and what we learned from that. What links do you see today between the Ottoman Empire of 100 years ago and what we do see in the Middle East today? What parallels are you seeing from what we should have learned 115, 110 years ago versus what we're seeing today?
Well, look, I mean, the British, yeah, as I already explained, they divided up the Ottoman Empire among themselves and the French. Palestine originally was meant to be a zone under international management. That didn't happen. At the same time, the British promised to support an independent Arab kingdom after the war. This was meant to initiate an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. And perhaps most critically, the British promised to establish a Jewish home in Palestine through the so-called Balfour Declaration. And as we all know, you know, from all of those contradicting pledges that were made during the war, it was that last one, the Balfour Declaration, that was the most enduring, and you know that's causing you know all the horrors and all the conflict in Palestine today.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, that's it. Sorry,
Your article talks about the British going into various countries in the Middle East about oil, and it seems like that you have said the same sort of thing could be said for Turkey about oil. And I think about recent conflicts and recent accusations made about various wars happening that America. Is it just always about oil? Is this where we've got to? It's just always about oil? Because that's what it seems like.
Well, I mean, oil is a very precious resource. Again, I wouldn't put it in that simple a phrase and say, look, you know, all conflict is about oil. But oil certainly played a role in British expansionist plans in the Middle East, because this was a time.
What about resource? You know, what if I change the word oil? If I change the word oil to resource, like whether it's land or whether it's oil, whether it's something, expansionism seems to be about something the expanding country wants in there, and that's why they expand.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, resources is one aspect that fuels wars and conflict and expansionism. But one other reason why the British were interested in the Middle East and were interested in certain parts of the Ottoman Empire is they wanted to create a land route between the Mediterranean and their colony in India, which, you know, if you think about it, that doesn't strictly have to do with resources. So that is more about, you know, facilitating transport and trade. So, you know, World War I is highly complex. I wouldn't boil it down to resources, or even colonialism is not just driven. It's not just driven by, you know, interest in resources, but it could be all sorts of other reasons.
Last question, and we've probably kind of touched on this through the conversation, is looking at the question of why, when it comes bringing it back to Gallipoli. How do we discuss today the question of why? Why did we send our men to fight in Gallipoli? Like, how should we approach that question of why today?
Well, I think, you know, we're already working through the history of colonialism in New Zealand, and I think a lot of progress has been made. You know, 20 years ago, people weren't talking about colonial violence. They weren't talking about the New Zealand Wars. Many New Zealanders would not even be aware of the New Zealand Wars and the violence that followed the Treaty of Waitangi and the forceful confiscation of Maori lands by the Crown. Like those aspects of history, they were sort of being silenced for a very long time. And it's only recently that we're facing up to that dark past and so are working through the history. So I wonder whether, as part of this attempt to confront our own dark history, whether we could also talk about, what were we doing in World War One? What were we doing alongside Britain, expanding the British Empire in the Middle East? I think that could be part of the same discussion. And I think as you said in the beginning, I think it would make us aware that not only did the British colonize New Zealand, but New Zealand then supported Britain in the colonization of other parts of the world. And they've done so previously. I mean, there's the Boer Wars, for instance, in the late 1800s in today's South Africa, where again New Zealand sent troops to support the British Empire. So Gallipoli wasn't the first example of that happening. So I wonder whether, to answer your question, I wonder whether we could sort of bring those two together, or discuss Gallipoli as part of our current attempts to work through the dark past.
Because if you bring that back to what's happening in the Middle East today, not so much that New Zealand is involved with it, although we do have people over there supporting the fight against the Houthi, is that old saying is, if you first don't acknowledge the history, then you're doomed to repeat it. And I don't think many people in New Zealand would be keen to be a colonizing, expansionist associated country today. Maybe there are some, but they're not in my circle of friends, if I can put it that way, Ollie.
No, but I think what I had in mind when I wrote that last section of that article is the debate around AUKUS and whether New Zealand should join Australia, the UK, and the US in this military alliance. So that's really what went through my head when I was phrasing that last part of the article. So I don't expect that New Zealand will contribute to the colonization of other parts of the world in the future, but if you broaden this and think more widely about international politics and how to navigate geopolitics as a small nation, I think there is something to be learned from Gallipoli, not to follow great powers in their endeavors, or at least don't do it blindly, but think carefully about what it is that you're doing.
Associate Professor of Political Science from the University of Waikato, that is Olli Hellmann. Olli, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been really informative. I appreciate your thoughts.
Oh, thanks, Ben. Kia ora.
Okay, team, Olli Hellmann there. We'll just keep trucking. Remember, if you follow me on Twitter @PatBrittenden, or you definitely need to follow the YouTube channel, which you're probably watching this on now. Most of you will be watching it on now, but you've got the Facebook page and Twitch page as well. Make sure that you like and subscribe to all of those places that you're watching, because this weekend there'll be a bunch of clips going out as well. We talked in the last break about how people can support us through Patreon, but another way you can support us is just to be our advocates. You see a clip that comes out that you like, share it around your social medias, tell other people about us, get them to come and check out what we're doing as we try and put this on for you and for people who are yet to find us, as well as we genuinely are trying to impact society in a positive way. So a bunch of clips going out this weekend. Check them out, pass them around, share them on, be our advocates, be our salespeople is another way that you could help support Big Hairy News. Paul the other one, you all know Paul the other one. He might even be in the chat right now. I don't know. If you are Paul, kia ora. Paul Barlow decided to join us today. He was very gracious with his time to jump on board this afternoon and have a chat with me to talk about the High Court rulings around Karen Chhour and how the Waitangi Tribunal didn't have the ability, weren't legally entitled to summoning Minister Chhour. And we had a bit of a chat about that because obviously Paul is a media guy as well. We did have to touch on the Melissa Lee situation as well. So I want to welcome to the show Paul Barlow, Paul the other one. Thank him for joining us this afternoon. And here is the chat for you guys. Welcome to the show, Paul Barlow, otherwise known as Paul the other one on many social media platforms. Paul, kia ora, and good evening to our ANZAC Day show.
Kia ora, Pat. Great to be here.
It's not what we've talked about or why we've talked about it, but what's ANZAC Day all about for you, if anything?
For me, I grew up in a family where most of the people served in the Navy. So it's a lot about Navy service and what was sort of sacrificed. All three of my uncles on mum's side were in the Navy. My grandmother on mum's side was a Navy nurse. One of my uncles was one of the unfortunate souls who got sent out to the atomic testing sites and ended up passing away from cancer about 10 years ago. So it's always been very important to us to make sure that we commemorate the day to remember the service and the sacrifice that they went through.
With the family lineage of armed services, was it ever something that you considered?
No, it wasn't for me because I think, well, particularly with my grandmother, she was very much, if you don't have a job, you're going into the military service for her kids.
Right.
And that was something that kind of got passed down. And I've always been working. Military service has just never been something that I've done. But my kids, my oldest son actually went through like Air Force Training Corps, the kids one that they do, the cadets. He was always very keen on that kind of stuff as well.
Very cool. All right. Well, listen, I saw you posting all over the interweb today about the Waitangi Tribunal and Karen Chhour.
Chhour, yeah.
Chhour. So I thought maybe I should have a chat with you. What I'd like to be able to do is break it down into the three parts. What is the Waitangi Tribunal?
Mm-hmm.
What were they expecting of the minister? And what has happened? I think there are three things to look at. And you, of course, sort of broke this on our show last night because you put a comment up there. I'd seen it pop up on my phone as well, but you put a comment up there pretty quick after that. And got it that she doesn't have to appear before the Waitangi Tribunal. So can we start at the very beginning, as Julie Andrews once said? It's a very good place to start.
Yeah.
If you were spelling it out to a 5-year-old, to someone who didn't really understand the Waitangi Tribunal, how would you describe it?
I'd probably go, all right, David, this is how it works. The Waitangi Tribunal was set up in the mid-70s to ensure that there was an outside judicial body that kept the Crown to account to meet its obligations under Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And that's pretty much it. Most people think of it in terms of settlements because that's the big work that they've done. But the whole point has been to make sure that the Crown meets its obligations, because when it comes to that particular document, the Crown is the one who's failed everybody. They're the ones who haven't met their obligations under it. So it was set up basically to keep people on task and make sure that the government and the Crown was staying on task when it came to dealing with Te Tiriti and getting the outcomes that were promised under that document.
So when you say judicial body, many people will think judge. When they think judge, they'll think court.
Yeah.
But we are being told this week by David Seymour and the likes that this isn't a court and they've got no power over us.
Yeah, it's a tribunal in the same way that there's a disputes tribunal. It's still part of the judicial system, but it's not the same as going to court. It's a sort of standalone process to it.
Okay. What was the tribunal expecting of Karen Chhour?
They wanted answers. They've got questions, Section 7AA of the Act is really specific. It was put in place in 2019 to deal specifically with rangatahi youth. So it's all about making sure you get the best outcomes for Māori youth that find themselves in that particular system. And the results have been really positive. There's been huge amounts of change in that timeframe because the CEO has to report every year on what they're doing, who they're interacting with, and what the outcomes are. And we're seeing much more equitable outcomes between Māori and non-Māori youth who find themselves in that Oranga Tamariki system. So what they want to know is why she wants to get rid of it, what is the evidence that this is something that needs to be got rid of, what her own personal experiences are, because that's how she's selling this. She was somebody who was lifted up when she was younger and put into foster care, and she felt that because of her Māori background, that it was a little bit harder for them to find the right place, and she didn't feel that she fit in because she'd grown up in Australia and the North Shore. And so they need to get those kind of context clues to work out whether or not the decision to remove this is something that has evidence behind it before they can turn around and say, well, look, it's clearly not something that's designed to harm Māori or put Māori back, or it doesn't meet obligations under Te Tiriti. And they want to know what's going on, but she hasn't answered.
The way I read or understand 7AA is the CEO needs to report back on the obligations to the treaty that there is and the outcomes, the integrating of the treaty into the ministry has impacted children. And if that's accurate, then what I hear ACT saying is we do not want to have any reports coming back to us talking about how the treaty interacts with this legislation. And when you say it like that, you're like, no, that kind of makes sense for ACT. What have I missed there, or is that pretty accurate?
That's pretty accurate. That's a big part of it. The actual input in the Act is really detailed on that. They have to take, Oranga Tamariki has to take into consideration things like hapu and iwi affiliations, what the child actually wants, because they might be somebody who doesn't feel like they have a connection already with Te Ao Māori. So putting them into an environment where that is the case shouldn't be the highest priority.
Right.
But the reporting itself also includes what they've done, but also what the outcomes have been, some of the organisations that they've worked with. And it says in the Act itself, if a Māori-led organisation goes to Oranga Tamariki and says, we want to work with you and this is how we plan to do it and how we're going to help, the CEO has to meet with them and he has to sit down and discuss how they could work together. There is nothing stopping something like Man Up, for example, going to Oranga Tamariki and saying, let's have that conversation. I don't know that they ever have, to be honest, but it is, there's nothing stopping them because they would technically fall into the definition of a Māori-led organisation that deals with those sort of issues. The reports themselves are really fascinating and they're publicly available, so people can jump online and see them, and they track all sorts of information like the number of kids that have been put into the system or had reports against them, or that have been uplifted and been rehomed or found new places to care. And in every single report that they've done since 2020, it's tracked downwards for rangatahi youth. So that the evidence is printed and published every year that this is working in the long run. And there'll always be exceptions. There'll always be the odd story that you hear about something not quite working right. Yeah. But overall, the results have been really positive.
It's interesting as well, because you use the word outcomes in that part of the answer to the question. And it seems that it's getting very positive outcomes. And we've heard our hairless leader talk for 18 months about how important outcomes were. And it just brings me back to that situation and that ponderance that this national-led government doesn't want research unless it suits their narrative. Doesn't want experience unless it suits their narrative.
Yes.
And does want outcomes unless it doesn't suit their narrative. Then all of a sudden they don't want them.
Yeah, well, Karen's the perfect example of that as well, because as she says, she was uplifted, she was put into foster care when she was younger, but Karen was not, in that age group in 2019 to 2020 when this law came into place. She is not that young. So the law that was guiding what happened to her then is completely different to the law that's in place now. And her experiences, while they've shaped her views, they're not necessarily relevant on what's actually happening with this particular piece of legislation.
So what we've got is a tribunal, otherwise known as the Waitangi Tribunal, part of the judiciary, basically going, yo, what's up? Can you explain this to us? And she's gone, no. She has actually pulled a Karen, pardon the pun, and said, I want to speak to your manager, being David Seymour. And so now that she's said no, and then now that the High Court has ruled she doesn't have to, where does that leave us? Or have I gone one step too far? Should we talk about what the High Court has actually said first and then go to where does that leave us?
Well, essentially the High Court has said that they can't see an actual path that legally forces an MP to be summoned in front of the tribunal, because it's not really ever happened before. This is the first time the tribunal's ever requested
because
that.
MPs would come. MPs would come and offer and answer questions.
Yeah, if they don't show up, they'll send something written, and Karen hasn't even done that. There's been no communication. And the tribunal is working on a bit of a time frame. We saw with Te Whaka Aiora, I think it was, the Māori Health Authority, the government sitting there going, oh, no, we're not going to rush this through to wind it up, and then putting it in before the tribunal had a chance to have a discussion about it. and the tribunal can't touch any piece of legislation that's going through the parliamentary process. So that's one of the reasons why they want to get these answers sorted now before this introduction is put into Parliament and the process starts. But the finding was essentially, it's never happened before. There's nothing actually saying it has to happen if the tribunal summons an MP. So we have to say she's not bound by it.
Yeah.
But my favorite part of the feedback that they gave was this is her fault. She was the one who has put this bill forward, that's talked about it, that's promoted it, that's put it on her own experience, and she is the one who's refused to answer questions. This is her fault, and she needs to wear that.
And the other thing now, obviously, is where to from here. Does this, on some level, maybe there'd be some ministers or MPs in the past that would have participated, now kind of go, well, fuck that. If Karen can say no, then we're going to say no too. Is this quite a bad result for the effectiveness of the Waitangi Tribunal?
I think so. I think the groundwork was kind of laid last week when you had Shane Jones and David Seymour sitting there criticising the role of the tribunal already. And the first thing David did yesterday when the result came out was a celebratory tweet with, was it something like finally or at last, or something humble and respectful.
As you'd expect.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, they've been laying the groundwork for this for a little while with those particular parties, and now they've got a precedent to say, well, we don't have to show up, we don't have to answer. But there is also a legal avenue that the people that brought the case before the court can go through, and they can raise it up to appeals or to the Supreme Court. But the meeting's tomorrow. So it's a really tough one to know if they're actually going to go ahead with it.
Yeah. It seems to me that the tribunal was playing an essential part in our judicial process, in our legislative process.
Yes.
And once again, if they're not able to summon people legally, what they are is something that's been advising and questioning and helping understand the situations now. And this has just given a big old green light to a bunch of people who currently sit on the right, who say things like, we should all be equal under one race. Who are now just going to basically nutsack this thing, and to them now this is an irrelevant tribunal for the rest of our term. That's how it feels. That's the damage it feels like it's done.
Oh yeah, it has huge ramifications, and this is a government that's not so keen on dealing with issues long term. They want to rush things through. They've got the fast track process, but responsibility is not something that they're so keen on having when they sign up to all of these fast track processes. So they're quite happy, I think, to take this out of the box. The original 1989 Act, I don't believe had any link at all, any mention of the Treaty of Waitangi.
Right. Wow.
Because it was done in the late 80s. It wasn't something that was common to go into most laws. It was a recognition that it's there as part of the founding documents. But if I remember correctly, that's one act that possibly didn't even have that in there.
Yeah, so it's just added another layer of scariness to perhaps the next 2 to 2.5 years that we might be facing legislatively with this government. Hey, look, before we let you go, and thanks for jumping in here on an ANZAC Day for a quick chat. You're a man of the media. We did a big show last night on Melissa Lee and what's happening there. Do you got any thoughts around that? Do you want to share with the punters a bit about that? Sitting here.
So I had the pleasure of having some very brief interactions with Melissa Lee last weekend, actually, and it at an event called Culture Fest here in Tamaki Makaurau. As one of the local MPs, she was there. She enjoyed the free food. She enjoyed not talking to people. It was really fascinating. I think the actual problem with her and with Penny Simmons for Mr. CEO Luxon is he gets really confused between confidence and competence. Yeah. And he thinks that somebody who's confident, like Penny Simmons was, is competent, but somebody who is confident and like Melissa Lee should be confident, 6 years in the role as spokesperson. She's been an MP for ages. She worked in the industry, but she was nervous when she was dealing with the press, and that comes through as not particularly confident. So he's equated that with competence. So I suspect that it's, he's getting his, aces in their spaces.
Oh, God.
I know. Yes. Every time I hear him talk, I just have this picture of the boss from Office Space with his coffee cup and his, I'm going to need you to come in on Saturday. Yeah, it's just, It's that, yeah.
That one you mean.
Yep, exactly. I bet you
some-
that red stapler is sitting somewhere on the 9th floor at the
Look,
moment.
yeah, funny you would say that because Alf Surprise Reshuffle sent me back that one. That's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to need you to get your aces in their places. That'd be great.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is such a corporate word salad. But I suspect because he is a CEO, and everybody who's worked anywhere near some kind of corporate organization, you'll know there's a difference between competence and confidence.
Yeah.
And CEOs are really good at getting it mixed up.
I wonder if CEOs never have to deal with that side of things because they only speak to the top level managers who you would expect to be competent and confident because they've gone through the system to become a very
Top
well
level
paid
manager.
high level manager. And I wonder if that's the difference. I mean, you could be an MP, you could be a minister with no experience in that area and be given a portfolio because you kind of have got a bit of a passion for that. And that reeks of perhaps on some level the quality of people who we've got running our country.
I mean, Penny Simmons was always an interesting choice for the disability portfolio because she has a disabled child. So for her, it's personal experience, and that's not a bad thing to bring to the table.
For sure.
But as somebody who has a child with special needs, surely she would know that, immediately cutting off funding now to everything to help people who care with it, that's just not going to fly. But also the fact that she didn't report back in December issues that they thought they'd found. And those issues are only there because the government needs to make all these cuts to pay their tax cuts. And that's the thing that there's so much going on. People forget to add that into any of the conversations. We
don't forget.
I know you guys don't forget. You guys are brilliant at it. But yeah, anything they do, everything they cut. The story yesterday that they were looking at cutting $6 billion worth of cyclone relief funding. That's ridiculous.
It also makes me think of Luxon's leadership. And I saw someone, it might have been on my Twitter feed, it might have been in someone else's, talking about actually what a competent leader would do is bring in the underperforming manager, would give them a chance to upskill, would give them, in fact, I was thinking about this, legally, you can't just fire someone.
No.
You can't just go, there's a process to go through. And I wonder, I mean, she hasn't been fired as an MP, but she'll have obviously lost a pretty big chunk of her salary moving off ministerial cabinet. Not at all?
No, because both of those MPs still have other outside of cabinet portfolios.
Okay.
Their salary still sits at around $249,000 a year.
Okay. But even so, a competent leader would work with his managers to get them up to speed first. And that didn't happen.
Yeah.
The other thing is I believe he's what he's trying to sell himself as a decisive, what did he say? This is how I roll kind of leader.
Jumping into action a month after it happens.
When I see him get rid of a New Zealand First or an ACT minister, that's when I will think he's a straight shooter, guy who's going to just go for it if he needs to. That's when I'll believe him.
I mean, you look at somebody like Casey Costello and what she did. She lied to cabinet when she was putting together her proposals around smoking and repealing the tobacco laws. Yeah. That's against the rules, that's against the cabinet manual to deliberately mislead the cabinet like that. But she's still sitting there because she's in Winston's party, and you can't go and upset the apple cart because suddenly he's not a leader of anything.
He's kind of more like a withered apple cart, like an apple that's been fallen off the tree and it's been sitting on the ground for a week or two, like a rotting apple cart. That might be a more accurate way to think about old Winston, Paul.
Oh yeah, very, very rotten.
Hey, it's lovely to have you on. I genuinely thanks so much for jumping in.
My pleasure.
Just last minute, we thought, let's do this. And you said, yep. And here we are for the lovely punters on their ANZAC night pre-recorded show. So is there anything else you want to tell people about where to find you, how to get you, anything that's going on at the moment?
You can track me down everywhere. I'm just busy doing a billion things all at once. So it's as always. But yeah, find me, Google me. It's easy enough.
Paul, the other one. Hey, dude, thanks for jumping in. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Pat.
All right, team, that's us done. Remember, if you want to be a part of what we do, super simple, head to patreon.com/Big Hairy News. As I said earlier, we're trying to get 50 new patrons. If you've been someone who's been around for a while, been a bit of a lurker, and you're thinking, yeah, I'd like to support these boys and what they do, you can literally do it through patreon.com/Big Hairy News. And remember, for you guys who want to rock some BHN merch, we've got the shop open for the next 7 days and it will be shut down for another month. You can also go there and get our new buffer gear. I am definitely going to get one of those grey hoodies. That's what I'm going to get. And I think Chewy wants to get a black hoodie. I think he told me, so we'll figure that out. So we definitely want to see more of these buffer shirts out there. Wear them to your next protest on a Saturday. when you're asking for the genocide in Gaza to stop. 25% of all the profits from the buffer gear, just the buffer gear, is going to be sent on to Medical Aid for Palestinians, a pretty cool charity that is operating out of London and working literally in Gaza as we speak. Thanks for being with us again tonight, crew. I know the pre-records are a bit different. I hope you've been lovely to each other in the chat, and we will catch you with another live show again Monday from 9 p.m. Remember, like and subscribe to whatever platform you're watching us on. If you don't already follow me on Twitter, go follow me on Twitter, because you get all the clips and stuff coming out there as well. Share our stuff around this weekend, and I will say thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll catch you Monday night for the next live edition of Big